The gospel we've just heard has one tiny word. It could hardly be smaller. As St. Matthew wrote it, it's 3 letters of the alphabet. And this tiny word has troubling and immense consequences. The gospel we've heard today starts with Jesus explaining to his disciples what must happen to him. Peter interrupts, takes Jesus aside, says to him that the God of mercy, the merciful God, won't allow this to happen. What Jesus says must take place. In the dialogue, Jesus rebukes strongly Peter, thinking that he's offering him something satanic, a temptation. And then Jesus resumes talking to all the disciples and brings us into the pattern of his life. So why is all this momentous, really? Jesus says that his suffering and his death must happen. A tiny word, must, of necessity, must happen. God wills it. Surely, mercy, a God of love, won't let this happen to Jesus, his Son. That a God of love, of mercy, cannot possibly want suffering and death. Now here, the believer, the Christian, and the atheist, in an odd way, meet. Both the Christian and the atheist find, for different reasons, what Jesus said unacceptable, or at least hard to accept by us, believers. Most of us, I imagine all of us, now and then, given that we've been brought into the pattern of taking up the cross and following Jesus, find it hard to accept that a good God should want that much sacrifice from us. How often have we heard, how can a good God, how can a God who is love and mercy let this happen, let alone want it? Yet, as Jesus has said, it must be so. The atheist, curiously, also finds what Jesus has said unacceptable. This is a controlling, all-powerful God whose will must be obeyed, must happen. And so many kinds of atheists, because of course there are many ways of being an atheist, find this God unacceptable because it diminishes us. It puts us under the sway of an all-controlling God. It must happen because God wills it. And the atheist rebels in the name of human freedom, of human dignity. If God isn't dead, then he must be killed. Or, given that the atheist doesn't believe that there is a God to kill, our belief in that kind of God must be killed to set us free, to give us back our dignity as human beings, crushed by this all-controlling God who must be obeyed, whose will cannot fail. Well, what are we believers then? After moments of hesitation, when we find this saying of Jesus, that it is God's will that he suffer and die, what are we to say? And what might we say to an atheist friend who has no time for such a God and rebels against him? First thing we need to say is, and the scripture as always says it very well, the kind of peace, tranquility, fullness that God gives us passes all understanding. And that's literally true. If we could understand fully God's ways, we'd be God. That doing God's will is what makes us free, what gives us peace, is because in this world it might look unacceptable, because love is not at home in a fallen world. Love makes its way against obstacles. It collides with other wills, other desires, far less than God has in mind for us. And why accepting God's will makes for freedom and peace and eternal life is because it fulfills us, but in ways that we can't yet fully understand and therefore can't accept. How should we discover God's will for each of us? The scriptures give us much revelation and guidance. Our life in the church, our prayer life, all those are sure guides to discerning God's will for each of us, that it must be so. And this doesn't contradict what Peter objects. Peter objects that a merciful God won't allow this to happen. Yet Jesus did suffer and didn't just die, was killed. Whenever then in our lives our fidelity to God, a love for God and for each other collides with something lesser, we have to tell ourselves that it's our knowledge that is limited, not God's love. And the phrase perhaps we use a little bit too glibly till things get difficult. It's a peace that's beyond all understanding. Some we can understand, all we should accept from a loving, merciful God. It's our knowledge that's limited, not Him.